Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I have a dear friend with a background in espionage who's fond of reminding me that the key distinction that helps spies to stay alive when they're in the field looking for intelligence is the distinction between interesting and important. So if you get that distinction wrong, you're often dead. And I think the fact that you're all here and the fact that there's such wide interest in this subject means that there's not much doubt that spirituality is interesting. Meaning, aliveness, belonging, becoming, being, delicious concepts that you can sort of feed off all day. But what is a bit hard to understand is why it's important. And that's really my focus tonight. We could spend a lot of time on definitions and clarifying relationship to religion, but I want to home right into why I think it matters and why we should take it seriously. I would start with Mahatma Gandhi's famous statement that we must be the change we want to see in the world. We must be the change we want to see in the world. Right, sounds right, but how is the question. Gandhi's statement strikes a chord because it highlights the forgotten imperative to connect social transformation with personal transformation. And I believe we struggle to make that connection precisely because, unlike Gandhi, we're gradually becoming spiritually illiterate. When it comes to the very practical business of aligning our vision and our values with our daily actions, spiritual experiences, perspectives, and practices are invaluable. Now, when I say spiritual experiences, I mean here experiences that make the world feel viscerally meaningful. For example, moments of aliveness, rapture, and homecoming that, as Guy Claxon puts it, make ordinary experience seem vapid and attenuated by comparison. By spiritual practices, I mean the disciplined and creative activities that support human development, like meditation and yoga, but also, for instance, writing, art, or even running, things we do to strengthen our inner lives. And by spiritual perspectives, I mean the value-rich visions of what it means to be here, that underpin our worldviews and life stances, and contextualize those experiences and practices. This question of perspective is important. It's often where the science-religion debate comes in. What is your worldview? What are your fundamental beliefs? But the debate between science and religion often sounds stale and hollow because it loses sight of practices and experiences which for many are more fundamental to spirituality. Matters of life and death have a powerful humanizing and leveling quality. Witness, for instance, in the solidarity and kinship we tend to feel in the aftermath of a terrorist attack or natural disaster. I mention such moments now because they illustrate a useful and generative distinction that I think is at the heart of spirituality. Spirituality for me is about our ground and not our place, and I'll explain what I mean by that. By our ground, I mean the most basic facts of our existence, that we're here at all, that we have this body that somehow breathes, that we exist through and for others, that we're a highly improbable part of a rather mysterious whole, and of course that we will one day die. That for me is our ground. In this context, the psychotherapist Mark Epstein helpfully adds that the spiritual is anything that takes us beyond the personality. The world makes us constantly think of our place, our constructed identities, our fragile reputations, our insatiable desires. And we're certainly not short of information about our place, reminded about it all the time. In 21st century Britain, the average urban adult is exposed to about 3,000 adverts a day. And we find ourselves caught up in what economist Tim Jackson calls the social logic of consumption. We are constantly called upon to reaffirm our attachment to our place. Of course, we need governments and markets, but their qualities depend upon our qualities as citizens and consumers. The neglect of our ground has made public policy pseudo-objective in its emphasis, squeezing out emotion and experience. We document patterns of social isolation rather than empathize with loneliness. And we strain to justify the arts instrumentally, expressing their value in economic terms, while knowing in our hearts that's really not what they're for. So the point is that while spirituality is often charged with escapism, in fact, I think the evasion of the spiritual is the real escapism. This is why spirituality is now a radical stance towards the world, and one I think that we need. It's no longer radical to suggest that it's mad to fetishize economic growth, and it really is quite mad. Percentiles of gross domestic product are the focal point of our concerns. Above all, this is a measure of human progress that's completely unrecognizable at a personal scale. What is somewhat radical, though, is to suggest that the reason we're not acting on such concerns with sufficient conviction and timeliness is because we've lost sight of our ground. We have lost sight of the potency of spiritual perspectives, practices, and experiences in bringing the fundamentals of our lives back to our attention. We need to know ourselves more fully, experientially, relationally, scientifically, because only the resulting awareness can help to make sense of why the gap between the way we are living and the world we would like to create continues to endure. But how much do we know about our ground? Experientially, relationally, scientifically. We are not the isolated conscious minds often assumed in our folk psychology and also assumed in many of the debates about science and religion. Rather, we are fundamentally embodied. Any spirituality that ignores how the body influences what we think and do will not be transformative. The success of yoga in the West is precisely because it was grounded in this understanding. And we need to think a little more about what we call the deep social. Not merely that we're social creatures, that's kind of hackneyed old hat stuff. But we're physiologically social. We evolve through and for each other. While empathy for our family and friends may come naturally then, we can dramatically expand this sense of we, this sense of empathy through space and time, through the right kinds of spiritual practice. Coming back finally to the connection between the spiritual and the political, I want to close with a thought from Martin Luther King, who combined the spiritual and the political to such great effect. He said, "Power properly understood is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic change." One of the great problems of history, he said, is that the concepts of love and power have usually been contrasted as opposites, polar opposites even, so that love is identified with the resignation of power and power with the denial of love. Now we've got to get this thing right, he said. Power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. It is precisely this collision of immoral power with powerless morality which constitutes the major crisis of our time. Spirituality, which we have to take seriously, for me is about coming to know the deep sources of our power and love and celebrating the hard but joyous work of bringing them together. Thanks very much.
Beyond belief, I think it's a really, really interesting place where we have tripped up very quickly over one of the kind of enduring problems in the Western religious tradition and understanding. And I think it's the idea that belief is sort of propositional. It's like a series of intellectual conclusions. I believe in God becomes a statement which is, I agree that he or she exists. And I think the person who really helped me radically rethink that was Karen Armstrong, when she pointed out the etymology of the word believe, which she argued came from the old Germanic word, which is much closer to a concept of commitment. So behove, I behove myself, I am committed. So I believe in Jesus Christ is an expression of commitment to Jesus. Rather, as I say to my son, I believe in you, at the beginning of a football match. It's an expression of confidence and trust. And I think, therefore, you can't get beyond belief. We all operate out of and in multiple relationships of confidence and trust. The next thing is spirituality. I really don't like this word. I went to a wonderful reading by the poet Michael Simmons Roberts, and he has a reputation for having an interest in religion, and of course in the questions at the end of it, someone said to him, what about your spirituality? And there was a very, very long pause, and finally he took a deep breath and he said, I think the spirituality word needs a long rest to recuperate its strength. Spiritual has become associated with a sort of free-floating, deracinated form of sort of personal growth and has lost that connection to a social, communal or political context, which of course I think is what Jonathan's trying to put back together again. But I also think another problem about the word spiritual is that it speaks to a sort of splitting, so that the spiritual is sort of over there and you have the kind of, the physical over there, and these are very, very sort of separate human needs. And then, of course, there's the material. And, this is a person is a sort of amalgam of all these different sort of sides and dimensions. And then you run into the problem with people saying, I'm just not a spiritual sort of person. Rather as I might confess that I'm not very musical. And it's sort of become a form of an aspect of your personality. I just happen to be spiritual. I just happen not to be spiritual. And it's that kind of splitting which I think means that you can sort of choose or not choose. You can, pursue your yoga or church going at the weekend and then pitch up at work on a Monday morning and, close down X number of businesses as a bank or whatever else you might want to be doing in your work. Just to start on the really important one, which is this imperative to connect social transformation with personal transformation. And perhaps I would add into that social transformation and political engagement with personal transformation. These are profoundly interconnected. The only thing is that to my surprise, since Jonathan and I talked about this 10 days ago, I've discovered that Gandhi never said that. That's a bumper sticker formulation, which actually Gandhi is much more kind of complex wording and much more nuanced. And Gandhi gets around the problem that a lot of people have with that phrase, be the change you want to see in the world. Because the danger about that phrase is that maybe that's as far as you go in terms of seeking change. So if you change yourself, you don't need to really worry about anything else. Get yourself in order ethically, and then you don't actually need to engage in those complex, difficult, painful collective struggles. Gandhi, I think, in his much longer formulation, I mean, I wasn't going to read it out, it's a paragraph or two actually, has been compressed, and I think we lose the real force of what Gandhi is saying, which is very, very much your point, Jonathan, about connecting social transformation with political struggle and with personal transformation. I think that at the heart of a spiritual engagement is the astonishing nature of our lives. We live for 70 or 80 years, if we're lucky, on a planet which is billions of years old. We experience extraordinary things, such as creating new life. We see beauty, we love, we recognize astonishing courage, and equally we recognize appalling brutality, cruelty, wanton greed, and terrible injustice. This is what being human is all about, and all these questions permeate every aspect of our lives. And that's why splitting them off and describing them as spiritual is a form of evasiveness, rather than putting them right at the heart of our lives and begin to think through what is a sustained form of engagement with these really, really difficult things. And it's that sustained engagement that I think religious traditions at their best have always offered. They offer a structured way to live with things which are profoundly uncomfortable. So I prefer to see all of this really as a conversation about what it is our human nature, what are we as human beings, fully responsive to the predicament and uncertainty of our lives.
I'm the director of Theos, which is a religion and society think tank with a broad Christian basis, and we've done quite a lot of research in this area on kind of post-religious Britain. What does this group who sit between the kind of committedly religious and the sort of consistently atheist, who are probably the majority of the population, what do they look like? How do we perhaps believe, behave, belong? But I think I'm here not because of that research that Theos has done, but because I am a Christian, because I'm the kind of out religious person on the panel, and I can perhaps help us explore some of the what the relationship might be, or what it has been, what it could be, and what it should be between the kind of spirituality that Jonathan is proposing and between faith traditions. And I think the key thing is the conception of the human. I think there's a fascinating and very welcome anthropology running through what Jonathan has said, which rejects the Homo economicus model. And instead what I see Jonathan proposing is a much more kind of honest and authentic anthropology, which acknowledges our interdependence, which acknowledges particularly, and this is what I think's so honest about it, our frailty, our failing, our sadness and our sorrow. And this is something that Christianity and other faith traditions have been very comfortable with. One of the things that attracted me to Christianity actually was its psychological realism. It felt like its vision of the human being as both full of original glory and potential and grace and love, and a very deep shadow side made sense of how I felt about myself and the humans I encountered in the world. Of course, the classical doctrinal word for this shadow side is sin. And I sometimes think maybe we should try and resurrect that word, but it's become to be associated with kind of lingerie and chocolates. So a more accessible way of describing it, which has been coined by Francis Spufford, and I need to give full credit to him. And forgive my language here, but I think you reduce the impact of it if you bleep it. He uses the phrase, the human propensity to fuck things up. This concept that we're grasping at, as has often been said, is fundamentally at the heart of the human problem. And no amount of wealth, health, or Apple products, as we have found, can fix it. Spirituality that takes this seriously, that is willing to occasionally problematize human nature rather than excusing it, which looks unflinchingly at, as Jonathan puts it, the gap between the way we are living and the way we would like to be living, which echoes St. Paul, can only be welcomed. We are not evidence Daleks. We are not people who demand kind of, where is your evidence? Give me a spreadsheet before every decision we make. Actually, for the vast majority of our lives, we are going on experience, instinct, and emotion. The kind of new atheist science religion debate gives you the impression that you come to your metaphysics by a process of rational argument, and that might be true for a few people like Antony Flew or C.S. Lewis, but I think for most of us that's just not the case. One final area that might be convergence and might be divergence depending on how it plays out is the fact that this is a spirituality that is seeking to go beyond the personality. Many faith traditions are appealing actually because they delegitimize the self, that they prevent us from being ultimate. As a Christian, the fact that I am not ultimate is painful to my ego, but a very deep relief. What's currently known or seen as spirituality is perhaps unfairly, but I think also sometimes fairly, not even attempting really to move people beyond the ego or beyond the personality, but deeper into themselves. Final point of probable diversion, which is the ground beneath the ground. Jonathan's clearly seeking something to ground this in, but even in his language of what he's describing as the most basic, I would say there will be people who challenge it. He uses words like kind of improbable and mysterious and our interconnectedness. Those aren't actually perhaps as basic, as widely accepted as we might like. So finding not even an objective ground, but a shared subjective ground is an ongoing challenge for a project like this. And that obviously plays into the idea of a shared spirituality and a kind of community. Ultimately, the difference between faith traditions like Christianity and spirituality, and there's obviously a huge overlap, and lots of Christians would want to talk about Christian spirituality, and lots of people who wouldn't necessarily call themselves religious might be involved in faith communities, so there's not a kind of binary distinction. But if you had to get to a fundamental difference, it would be the objective transcendent, or in less philosophical terms, God. I feel like I can probably bring up God in this kind of discussion, but even now I feel nervous about it. Christian spirituality, which will often look a lot like the kind of spiritualities that Jonathan is perhaps proposing, is ultimately different because it's focused on something outside of itself. It is grounded in and directed to not just a purpose, but actually a person, and not just a kind of Kantian ethical concept of God, which is a handy philosophical marker, but a relationship, something, at least from a Christian's perspective, objectively beyond ourselves. Faith traditions and Christian communities can come together agreeing on enough, actually I think encountering something similar enough that we can respond to it together.
It's very hard to disagree with anything that I've heard, but I'm going to. Why is Madeline so freaked out by the word spirituality? Why, is Elizabeth sort of practically shaking at the idea of mentioning God? Why does Jonathan feel like he's being brave? What conjuncture are we at? What moment in the history of ideas has got us to this point? There was a time when we could talk about religion and spirituality. If you're in the Middle Ages, it was probably okay. There weren't that many atheists. There were a few, but there were fewer and far between. We then have the Enlightenment, and new values of reason and science and medicine begin to challenge belief in God. And in the 20th century, and I think Adorno and Horkheimer probably spell this out most convincingly, God died in Auschwitz. How do you possibly believe in anything spiritual, religious, after the experience of the death camps, right? So it seems like we've gone through a sort of phase of belief, doubt, and atheism in the face of what appears to be sheer evil, and are now coming out the other side in some way. But how we come out the other side is the question, and there's something about the agenda here which is to do with whether or not it's time yet to reclaim spirituality, regardless of whether it's the right word or not at the moment. Is it time? Can we put our heads above the parapet yet and start talking about it once more? It's difficult for people who might naturally be atheistic because of their education to adopt a religion. And religion has all sorts of connotations that we now have learned to distrust. So we've arrived at this point where it's kind of almost time to sneak back and start thinking about spirituality, but we don't want really to be religious. So what are the choices? Can you really be spiritual without being religious? I don't think it's enough to run yourself a bath, put in some aromatherapy oils, light the candles, sort of breathe deeply and, think about Gandhi and, poor suffering children in Africa and how you're going to donate some money in order to be spiritual. I mean, I think that is a lifestyle choice. For me, that is not a spiritual practice in any way. It seems that the first instinctive step out of the woods is to what I would call a sort of ethical humanism. It's like we believe in the value of the human, the word human is used a lot, and we believe in ethics, being ethically good, okay? Now, I don't have a problem with ethical humanism, and how could you? But I still am not sure whether that is the same as spirituality or counts as spirituality. You can be very human, very humanist, you can be very ethically good, you can be virtuous. Have you accounted for all of spirituality and spiritual life once you've done that? I think there has to be a point in spirituality where the human gives over, is no longer in play as the human. Because the important thing about the relationship with the divine is that humanity itself is in some way reframed or touched in a different way or altered or transfigured. So the very value of humanity, I think, has to be put in question once we start talking about humanity. I don't think it's good enough just to say we're good humans. I think most of the so-called spiritual practices at the moment, like you were saying actually, are not difficult at all. They're rather easy. You go away to a nice retreat, in Spain or somewhere, do lots of yoga, eat some organic food, come back and slightly show off to your friends in a slightly self-effacing way. And it's, that is not difficult. There's no discipline in that. There's nothing which I think moves you beyond your humanity, which is where I think the most interesting edge of spirituality lies. And after all, the word spirituality contains the word spirit, which is an even more contentious thing, I think, to speak about. We've talked about embodied knowing. We are embodied creatures. The transcendent being in Hegel, who writes a lot about the spirit, he wrote a whole book called The Phenomenology of Spirit. He said the spirit must appear, it must become real, or it's not valid. If the spirit doesn't manifest, it's just an abstraction. It's got to become a phenomenon. It has to be phenomenologically present. So it has to become embodied. But just because the spirit becomes embodied, it doesn't mean that there's a splitting between spirit and body. The two are integrated in some way. So it's how, for me, we are embodied and spiritual while being ready to put our humanity aside. And that, for me, is the interesting question.